Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry that we can't be together today, but I'm excited to share some ideas and stories with you about how the Natural Capital Project is really shining a light on the intimate connections between people and nature. I'm Mary Ruckelshaus, the Managing Director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford, and I'm so happy to be here. So what we do in places around the world is account for nature's contributions to society. We do this through co-creating new science and practical approaches and leave powerful tools in the hands of local leaders, from communities to governments to multinationals, so that those leaders worldwide can create a more sustainable future. And it's an interesting time to be thinking about these approaches for natural capital accounting in the oceans. There was a UN high-level panel that I was part of in 2020 that really focused on a bunch of new initiatives for the ocean, one of which that I worked on was about governance, thinking about the ocean commons and how fish don't know borders, and pollution doesn't know borders, unfortunately. So things that really need to shift in order to more effectively govern this ocean commons are our relationship with the ocean and our relationships with each other, how communities and governments and international bodies work together, and then the relationship between nations. So I'll touch on these as I go through a few stories today. And the hallmark of that new governance shift for the ocean commons is really this top-down and bottom-up combined work together. So the local level is where the innovation comes from, a lot of the deep knowledge and understanding of how systems work, and also what people care about. And that can be transmitted and amplified at the global level through open platforms and also sharing information so that there can be more coordinated responses to scale innovations. And a wonderful way to think about this, as we've really evolved our thinking about what we care about in terms of species and habitats in the ocean and all over the planet, came from Georgina Mace, where she pointed out this shift in our way of framing conservation concerns. In the 60s, it started out with nature for itself, then transitioned really to nature despite people as we became aware of the negative impacts people were having on species and habitats, and now has gone through the nature for people and the more, I think, sort of rational way of thinking about it and much more sensible, which is this intertwining of people and nature. And that's really what all these approaches that I'll tell you about today, that's the aim and the focus that we have. So instead of this sort of way of thinking about people harming nature, and that's our main role and experience with nature, this is part of it. But if you think also about all the ways that nature sustains us and boosts us, and if we can help it do more of that, provide clean water, fisheries, food, and spiritual benefits, then we can think more holistically about the intertwining between people and nature. And I'll use the term ecosystem services in this talk. And what I think about that is how I define it is that ecosystem services are the flows of benefits from natural capital assets like species and habitats to people. And that people, especially the people in places who are affected, have a lot to say about both defining the problem, in what ways are people in nature not thriving, for example, and also to lead in co-developing the solutions. So we start in all of our places where we work by meeting the key leaders and listening to them. So where we work has been all over the world in this co-creation model. These dots on a map show some of those. This isn't even updated, but I'll just tell a few stories about a few of these places today. And I want to start by introducing you to Chantal Clark Samuel. She's the CEO of the Belizean government's Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute. And she's working in places all around Belize where tourism is the biggest economic driver. And she knows and understands, as most Belizeans do, that maintaining the ecosystems that draw these tourists are crucial, as well as the subsistence and commercial fisheries and protection from storms. So people like Chantal and the communities that she leads, who are living and breathing in a place, need to really define the problem and lead in co-developing the solutions. So Chantal cares about the access of tourists to Belize's famous keys, and this is Key Cocker here, and finding the right amount of supporting infrastructure like roads and boardwalks and toilets to encourage visitors without harming the ecosystem. So Chantal set up this top-down and bottom-up government process for development planning in Belize and invited NatCap to join in bringing some of the new science and tools. So Chantal also cares deeply about how mangrove clearing is imperiling properties and infrastructure. And this ecotourism business in Small Hope Bay is really an example of how this mangrove and a tourism location can really coexist. Instead of clearing the mangroves for views, you can keep them together and maintain a number of other benefits in addition to the tourist experience. So the process we went through with Chantal in Belize was really aimed at the government's top-down setting this goal for Belizeans and the global community of balancing a sustainable use of the environment for the benefit of the Belizeans. And that turned into some very specific questions that our NatCap team helped address with government leaders and community leaders in Belize. So first is, where should coastal ecosystem investments be made to secure fisheries, tourism benefits, and mitigate risks? And what improvements in ecosystem services can be expected? And then finally, who will be impacted? Who's impacted both positively and negatively by alternative zoning and other management policies? So we developed this process that was very much a co-development process of defining the partners, who are the actors, what are the key aims of this development plan, and then compiled data generated with these local knowledge experts, the baseline and future scenarios. Then we evaluated them with spatial models and local data, synthesized the results, then looked at them, and people said, well, wait a minute, there's a lot better information that's not in there. So it's an iterative process. So these were very, very engaged community groups that are shown in the colors here on the coast of Belize, so that you can see that many of the communities hit different parts of the biophysical setting and social setting in Belize. So each of those colored zones had a community action committee that worked with the central government to develop this national plan. So we helped map the current human uses. And again, we would get available data, then we would show these community groups what we had. They would say, oh, I have better data on some of this, and we would iterate to make sure that the information going into our assessment was the best possible. Then we developed with them different scenarios of, here's a conservation future, here's a future that's more intensive development. And then this informed management scenario became the one that we kept iterating around and trying to get better combinations of where activities would be allowed, and therefore how we could harmonize these multiple objectives. And the underlying models for all of this that we used are really reflective of a coupled human and natural system, where you think about biodiversity and ecosystems like the coral reef on the left is the supply. Then the processes such as waves crashing on a reef, if the reef is healthy, those waves can be attenuated. That's part of the green, the ecosystem part of this. And then what's really novel about an ecosystem services or a nature's benefits to people approach is that you think about the people. So the service comes in when you think about who's benefiting or who's negatively being affected. And then the value of that service can be in many, can be in dollars, in monetary currency, or it can also be in currencies like social cohesion and the different types of cultures that are supported. In Belize, through this co-development process, we expressed the key ecosystem service priorities in different currencies of value. So in lobster fisheries, for example, it was expressed as both pounds of lobster landed, which is what the fisheries ministry cared about, but also market value, which is what a lot of the local communities and commercial fishers care about, in Belizean dollars. Similarly, for tourism, we express the values as the number of visitors to different places under these different scenarios, but also the expenditures, again, in Belizean dollars. And finally, the shoreline protection was expressed in biophysical terms. So how much beach was eroded in square meters, but also what's the avoided property damage. So you can see the different currencies can be customized depending on what local decision makers most care about. And those currencies of value and the scenarios, that was the final preferred scenario, ended up in the government approved integrated coastal zone management plan. So the results looked like this. So this is where the spatial modeling comes in. This is just one of those benefits, lobster fisheries under the different scenarios. And the warmer colors show higher values. And you can see in this case, relative to current, the conservation scenario did the best, but the informed management was very closely sort of following the conservation scenario. So you got much greater pounds of lobster catch under the informed management scenario, as well as revenues relative to current baseline. And you can see that these sort of same kind of spatial maps and looking at the values in different currencies we did for tourism and also coastal protection. So the final plan really was able to harmonize these multiple objectives, and the spatial details that went into it with the help of the local experts were key. So this process went through several iterations, as I said, but it really builds trust over time and legitimizes with local information and local experts. It's their process, it's their information, and therefore their decisions are more robust. So the outcomes in this story in Belize are that the plan was approved in 2015, and the government is now undertaking a 5-year update, and NatCap is helping them add some more climate information to that plan and evaluate how well the implementation is going. There are several loans from IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Green Climate Fund for implementation. So it's not just a plan that's sitting on the shelf. The reef was removed, the Belizean reef was removed from UNESCO's World Heritage Sites at Risk as a result of the protective measures in the plan. And now, most recently, this past 6 months, NatCap worked with the Belizean government to include blue carbon and other co-benefits that the plan was able to articulate in Belize's nationally determined contributions submission for the Glasgow Pact. So this really is creating momentum around nature-based approaches, and there's a lot of improved capacity in the country, and Chantal and her fellow country people are really becoming leaders in the Mesoamerican reef for these sorts of approaches. But this was all about relationships and building trust and letting the local leaders lead, and we brought in science legitimacy that they now own and continue forward into the future. So for most people in most places where we've worked, the trust is key, and the heart comes first in all of these engagements, and then our heads. That's one of our big takeaways for these sort of co-creation processes. So I'll go much more quickly through this example in the Bahamas, which is an interesting, really different entry point. So similar services of mangroves and coastal protection services from storms and sea level rise, lobster fisheries again, and also tourism, which is a big economic driver in the Bahamas. But the entry point here was different. So the priorities for the stakeholders in the Bahamas was really human development aims. So they're really interested in reducing risk of infrastructure to coastal hazards, and then also how they can get better access to markets and schools and learn new trades for livelihood support in these family islands. So the ecosystems underpin all of those human development goals, but the ecosystems weren't in the Bahamas the primary objective for this government plan. It was a very similar participatory process that the Office of the Prime Minister organized. And we went to all these family islands, and we started in Andros Island, which is the largest, and did the same sort of very engaged participatory process. You can see on the left these hand-drawn maps. So we worked with community groups in their churches, in their homes, and they have so much knowledge about where the best lobster fishing grounds are, where the conch is, where fly fishing, and we were able to take that knowledge and digitize it and put it into our models. This picture here shows people from the Ministry of Works because infrastructure is under their purview. So they became very engaged in the process and are now trained and using many of the tools that we developed together. So that one end result was the master plan. It's a spatial development plan for this Andros Island, and there's now a government-wide, nationwide coastal vulnerability plan. And it really lays out guidelines for siting green infrastructure projects that are aimed at these development goals. So really development opportunities that are benefiting both people and nature. And again, there's an IDB loan for implementing this plan that followed from this process that we went through. An interesting and heartbreaking event happened in the middle of our 3-year engagement in the Bahamas. Hurricane Joaquin hit during the first year of our engagement, which caused incredible damages throughout the country. This is showing the east side of Long Island and the flooding. And then in the very next year, Hurricane Matthew hit. So what we had luckily done in building trust with the Ministry of Works and other stakeholders in the government and communities is we had built a viewer and tool that they had said they wanted to have this in their hands to do post-disaster reconstruction planning. So they have our tool that shows where we predicted habitats could provide the greatest protection from coastal storms, and where in places where habitats were degraded, the most damages were likely to occur. And sadly, that is where they saw the greatest damages. So that gave them confidence in the tools that we had developed together, in the models, that the results were actually being borne out by these 2 tragic hurricanes. But it gave them more impetus to plan ahead and get in front of the resilient side of this, as well as the post-disaster reconstruction. And these loans that are now coming in from the Inter-American Development Bank and others are really to supplement and replace these old breakwaters that are occurring along their infrastructure and put in mangroves and other protective habitats so that the storm damage is much less over time. So again, these outcomes are incredible. They're getting financing for the plans that they've developed, and there's increased capacity in the country and understanding of how nature helps them achieve their development goals. So we're now developing, based on these cases in Belize and the Bahamas, similar tools for all 26 countries in the Latin America and Caribbean region with the Inter-American Development Bank. So we can take these innovations in 2 countries, that's the bottom up part of that conceptual model from the UN high-level panel, and now use the top-down convening power and influence of Inter-American Development Bank and their funding to spread these ideas and more tightly connect the financing for nature-based solutions to the planning. So we had big discussions with this at the IDB's international meeting about how to do this and how to help amplify the stories and innovations that are happening in these countries and help spread those more rapidly throughout Latin America and the Caribbean through IDB's whole range. So these approaches I've told you about, I just talked to you about one scale, really, the country, the national scale in that Belize coastal zone plan and the Bahamas. These are applicable, and we've done these ourselves, and I'm sure people listening have as well, at smaller subnational scales, such as we did a big planning effort with Colombia's Gulf of Morisquillo recently, and now that's being scaled to some national development plan guidance for the whole country. And then China has done incredible national scale ecosystem assessments using our tools and approaches, and have zoning plans and payment schemes at multiple scales. And then our models also have been used at the international global scale for the IPBES assessment that was completed 2 years ago. So these are very scalable approaches, and people are part of all aspects of it. And the hallmark of this approach is this Invest toolkit that we have developed and used. And this is also a co-development example. So scientists from our network from over 300 institutions have contributed the testing and also the new algorithms in these tools. And they're designed to be very simple, and any of our engagement experts in each place where we work are trained in these tools, and now they're further innovating and taking off with them in ways that we never could have imagined. And then finally, at the big scale, beyond these innovations in individual places, we convene people. The bottom picture is a big training that we've done in China every year. And the top is our annual meeting at Stanford, which we sadly haven't had for a couple of years now, where we bring people, convene them from around the world, and they share their successes, but also their lessons learned and frustrations, so their ongoing challenges. And they really do the Chinese government will sit with the Indonesian government and talk about what's working in your country, what's not working, and how they can share these governance breakthroughs for policy and finance, but also what's working in terms of saving nature and people so that they can be harmonized together. So there's lots of guidance now. The multilateral development banks and companies are sharing information with each other so that we don't have to keep recreating the wheel, and assessments at global scales like the IPBES one. And we've shared some of these stories in a book that came out at the end of 2019, this Green Growth at Works book that I encourage you to see if you haven't. But also, I mostly encourage you to share your own stories and help us amplify and accelerate these solutions, because people in nature can be harmonized, and we can drive greater and more targeted natural capital investments if we just listen to the people who have the local knowledge, who understand what their problems that they're trying to solve, but also understand better than anybody else what the solutions are. So thank you so much for listening. And I wish we were together to have a discussion right now, but I really welcome any contributions and interaction online. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.